special way. That's right. Welcome, New Mexico, around the country and around the world. If you're listening, you are tuning into Dialogue, KSFR's Friday evening talk show devoted to you, and we are changing the conversation. And joining us today is Jack Loeffler. As a traveling jazz musician, Jack Loeffler settled in Santa Fe in 1962. Since arriving, he has accomplished much and is considered a New Mexico treasure, from acting as a fire lookout to the curator at the Museum of International Folk Art and the Center for Arts of Indian America. He's also founded both the Central Clearinghouse and Black Mesa Defense Fund, environmental organizations, and established a 50-plus year oral history project that continues today, traveling throughout the American West, Mexico, and beyond, recording folk and indigenous music, stereo recordings of natural habitats, and hundreds of interviews with authors, philosophers, scientists, cowboys, Indians, and salt of the earth. He has then donated this collection to the New Mexico History Museum. He's written dozens of published essays, produced over 400 documentary radio programs for public radio, has authored 8 books, and recorded hundreds of concerts of chamber and choral music for posterity. And you can read all about his life in his memoir entitled Listening to the Song of Life. And it's going to be published by the University of New Mexico Press in 2019. And he's currently producing a new documentary radio series to be released in 2019. Whew, welcome, Jack Loeffler.
I'm tired, but thank you. Thanks so much, MK.
No, that was a challenge to just get through without stumbling, because, boy, there's a lot there.
Oh, well, it's been a lot of fun. Let me put it that way, right down the line.
Yeah, I imagine. Can I be born again and born as you?
Wow, gee whiz.
Because you sure have done a lot. Now, you've recently done a lecture. You just gave a lecture entitled
Restoring Indigenous Mindfulness Within the Commons of Human Consciousness.
And that is a mouthful and a mindful. And that's what we're going to do here today, is talk about that. So you talk about cognition as having a long history of life. What do you mean by that, or can you expound on that?
Yes, I can. Actually, in 2014, I read a wonderful book by Fritjof Capra, who some people may recall for having written The Tao of Physics that came out in 1975. But after Fritjof had written this book, A Systems View of Life, A Unifying Vision, I called him up and asked if I could fly out to Berkeley and record him talking about this. And one of the things that he points out, well, he had been trained in quantum physics in Austria, which is really amazing to me, that he was able to shift from quantum physics to hardcore biology, ecology at an academic level. And he collaborated with a man from Italy, Pierluigi Luisi, on this book. But the upshot is they had taken much of their cue from 2 Chilean biologists, one named Humberto Maturana and the other one Francisco Varela. And their point was, and Maturana wrote it down, and I've got it stuck to my computer, but I'm going to read it rather than try to remember it. And what he wrote was, living systems are cognitive systems, and living as a process is a process of cognition. This statement is lawful for all organisms with or without a nervous system. Now, that's a profound thought. And so in other essays and things that I've written and interviewed folks about, has been revealed by a lot of the people in the biological world that the last universal common ancestor, known as LUCA acronym, occurred somewhere maybe just almost 4 billion years ago and probably blinked into life near a hydrothermal vent in some ancient ocean. But if that were the case, that single cell had some level of cognition.
Yeah, I thought that was amazing to read that when you sent me your notes. I mean, this notion of cells as having cognition.
Well, it blows my mind. It really does. Mm-hmm. But they don't have cognition in the same sense that we might, but they have levels of awareness that they're aware of other cells. They're aware of what's comfortable to remain alive and what might be necessary to eat. And there are two different kinds of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and the prokaryotes don't really have a nucleus, but the eukaryotes, which fill our bodies, do. And according to all of these different folks that I've been working with of late, all of these different cells have some level of cognition, which means that when you take a walk outside, you're walking through a whole ecosystem filled with different levels of awareness. Like when I take my walk every morning, I always say hi to the juniper and pinon trees, touch them, wish them well, etc.
Yeah.
And it's like that. And when I sit down beside the trail, as I do, the whole purpose of that drill is to try to intuit this level of life that's going on around me. And subsequently, what that's led me to is understanding that we, as a conscious species, and we're not alone as a conscious species. Octopus is a conscious creature, very conscious, totally alien mind, 3 brains, amazing. And it sees in part through its skin. It's colorblind optically, but it sees color through its skin.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that.
And this is all just mind-blowing to me. In other words, there are levels of grasping what's real around one, and there may be levels of that which don't apply to us because we haven't developed. It's like having senses other than the 5 senses that we're born with, and it's really hard to imagine what a sense like that would be.
Yeah.
And so that's what we live on, a planet that is probably a cognitive system on a certain level.
Right. I noted that also, that you refer to the planet as a living, self-regulating, self-organizing system in and of itself.
Yes, it is. And James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis forwarded that whole notion, the Gaia hypothesis, some years ago. And at first they were poo-pooed by the scientific community, but later on many scientists have really gotten to understand that these were magnificent minds who put all of this stuff together. Ironically, I bought a car from Lynn Margulis in 1964.
As a side note.
But at any rate, the point I've been really trying to make is that we as a species, the human species, we've attained a level of consciousness, and we have so misused it over the last, say, 300 years, basically, since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And what a thought. I mean, we're now approaching the end of things as we know it, unless we imminently straighten up our collective act around this planet.
You know, something else that you spoke about was the idea that even science, I mean, we see science taking a different sort of path in some ways, I guess you could say, of looking, rather than looking at our history of being, rather than being a competitive history, it is actually more cooperative in nature. And so that idea of kind of shifting our paradigm in moving forward as we survive, is that what we need to do? Is that what's required here for literally our own human survival?
I think so. I think it's our natural condition. Now, there are so many factors right now that we're facing that are almost overwhelming, not the least of which is human overpopulation. To bring up a thought, I'm 82 years old. I was born in 1936. The human population had just gotten to be a little bit better than 2 billion. And so in my lifetime, it's more than tripled. Wow. In 82 years, which is, say, 4 generations. It took to almost quadruple at the rate we're going. It will have if I last long enough. But the upshot is that there was a book that affected me enormously way back when. It was written by Peter Kropotkin, who was the great turn of the 20th century anarchist philosopher. He was basically, he went into exile outside of Russia. He was born in Russia, but he became a world-class geographer, biogeographer basically. Spent many years in Siberia, mapping mountains, but otherwise watching the condition of life. Mm-hmm. And on page 300, and I'm paraphrasing here, of his magnum opus, Mutual Aid, he stated clearly that evolution of species and human culture owe far more to mutual cooperation than mutual antagonism. And I find that to be one of the fundamental things that we have to factor into our cultural purview at this point.
Absolutely. And you also talk about the values of honoring mutual compassion as well as cooperation. And also you list 5 topics or big, larger issues that you think need to be addressed imminently. Can you go through those? The population?
Well, yeah, actually,
food.
I've got my own notes. I'm glad I brought them because, at my age, trying to remember all of this.
All I can say is I'm impressed with you being able to pronounce, much less remember, the vast majority of authors you've read.
Oh, well, here's the thing. Back in 1972, the Club of Rome funded a group of people, or were funded, to look into what we were faced with from the point of view of problems that were going to bring us down. And the nature of the book that came out was called Limits to Growth. And the authors were Donella and Dennis Meadows. I think she's now gone, but it was an amazing book. I had to review it for a magazine I was working on back in those days, Clear Creek magazine, one of the first environmental magazines. And the upshot is that they named 5 major categories that had to be addressed within the next 30 years, or it was over. One of them was population. Another was consumption of natural resources. Another was pollution. And there are a couple of more.
Industrialization?
That's one of them.
Let me see. I have here population, food, industrialization, pollution, consumption of non-renewables.
Yep.
Other considerations?
We have other considerations that I've thought about for a long time.
War.
Yeah, nuclear war is still imminent, even though it should have gone out of style many years ago. Thank you. And
economic stability.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest ones. I think of pandemic as being a very real probability. I have a good friend, a biogeographer here in town named Melissa Savage, a brilliant lady. And she and I talk about this, but pandemic looks to me like a very possible one. Economic collapse. We have, since the Industrial Revolution, we've focused on formulating this economically dominated paradigm that is now at the heart of our cultural perspective. And my old friend Gerrymander, great name, I kid him about his hypothetical sister Sally, but at any rate, Jerry wrote a book recently called The Capitalism Papers, Fatal Flaws of an Erroneous System, which I highly recommend. That's one of the great books. In it, he points out that at the tail end of World War II, the members of the 90 nations who were part of the Allied forces, and those of us who lived through that war know who that was. We fought the Axis power. But members of the 90 nations who comprised the Allies met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and devised what was to become both the World Bank and the global economy, the International Monetary Fund. That occurred concurrently with the arrival of television in a public way. And this is why Jerry wrote his book, another book, Gerrymander, wrote a book earlier on called 4 Reasons for the Elimination of Television, because it captivated consciousness to such an extent that Madison Avenue types were able to rearrange cultural perspective through television and thus invigorating consumerism and economics as being the driving factor. Now, that is really hardcore news. This is now 3 generations later, say from 1950 to now. 3 generations of us, first in America and then gradually creeping around the world so that it truly is a global economic culture, are dominated by economics, which is basically founded on turning habitat into money.
Yep.
My late best friend, it's also founded on growth for its own sake. And Edward Abbey, a buddy of mine from days of yore, came up with a good one-liner. Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. And it's so right on. And so what I'm concerned about, say with regard to today's body politic, is that we're all at the right and wrong of the wrong issues. It's really amazing to me that a conscious species such as our own could allow ourselves to get in this predicament of being faced with myriad factors that we're not looking at, but rather still continuing to focus on economic growth for its own sake. Now that is a very paltry use of this collective consciousness that we have. And so when I look at voting today, I voted, I've got it right here on my vest, but I voted, but the issues that are really important don't even really get talked about. Yes, people do talk about the fifth factor that I include here, global warming and climate instability or climate change. And we are now, within moments, if we haven't already, going past the point of no return with regard to temperature rise of 2 degrees centigrade, which is going to completely rearrange ecosystems around the world, is already doing it big time, and is going to inevitably result in a hardcore reduction in the human population, and it won't be the easy way to do it.
So what do you recommend? I mean, it's easy to feel sort of powerless against these mega forces that are out there, the profit makers of today, huge international corporations. How do we as ordinary citizens take action against that to bring this greater balance of what you're talking about? You know, how do we bring more cooperation to the table? Is it possible? Is all hope lost? I mean, how can we fight against? And unfortunately, we only have 6 more minutes for this segment, but we're going to extend this conversation into our another show called Dialogue, and that's on Friday evenings 5 to 6. So we'll go further into this. But in summary, what hope can you give us?
Well, to me, it is not hopeless. I ended one book recently with the sentence, "It will take our children to save us from ourselves." But I also know that each one of us can really begin to invigorate a level of unconcentrated governance. In other words, to me, decentralization of governing power is absolutely critical right now. We have invested all of our power as a species in a political body that's dominated by a corporate-induced way of life. In other words, we have the best politicians money can buy. You know, we really do. And we have some good ones, but even the good ones still don't see the entire array of factors that we have to contend with. So I have a very good buddy named Gary Snyder. He's a poet who lives out in California, and he talks about bioregionalism. He and I have talked about that for many, many years. But Gary talks about how bioregionalism, which is basically aligning your own individual psyche with the habitat where you live, and then functioning from there. In other words, Garrett Hardin had written this book, or this essay entitled The Tragedy of the Commons, back in 1968. That affected me enormously. But basically that idea is that when too many people are using the commons crashes. In other words, the ecosystem goes down. And so he was saying that the only way you can avoid this is to privatize the commons. Well, I don't agree with that. I think it has to be done a different way. Later on, a wonderful lady named Elinor Ostrom, who got the 2009 Nobel Prize for her book, Governing the Commons, talked to me about her concept that she and her husband have put together, polycentric governance, where it occurs at different levels. But to me, where it really has to start is at the grassroots. And so I did a book recently with my daughter called Thinking Like a Watershed. That book came out about 6 years ago. And in that, I've tried to define it's an anthology and involves people from throughout the Rio Grande Valley and beyond, indigenous peoples, talking about this, because I have much greater faith in the indigenous wisdom that comes along with the people who have actually sprouted from this soil, to understand how this soil is going to best react within a sense of, we have to function within a sense of collaboration with the habitat itself. In other words, recognize that we are part of habitat and that it's in everybody's best interest for us to collaborate with habitat, keep it healthy, because it's what keeps us healthy. And then using that as the foundation rather than the economic paradigm that has totally blown us away.
Yeah, it's also I think it's interesting that we're almost coming full circle as a human species and literally going back to our roots, our indigenous roots, for leadership and guidance to providing a way forward.
I totally concur with that. I mean, one of my great friends in this lifetime was the Tewa Indian lady, Rena, who was interesting to me because she'd gotten both her master's, bachelor's, and PhD degrees, but basically so that she could engage in real dialogue with people born into what to her were an alien culture. Mm-hmm. Because she was born into the Tewa culture of the Santa Clara Pueblo on the Rio Grande. Mm-hmm. And her perspective is so amazing to me. She's gone now, 3 years ago, October 30th, and one of the great friends in this lifetime. But at any rate, that indigenous wisdom, we can't even begin to understand it. And I know this for a fact because at one point, she and her sister Tessie asked me if I would record Tessie reading the Tewa language dictionary, which she read it in Tewa and then read it in English, and I would listen between readings to the discussion between Rena and Tessie addressing the difference in thinking. Huh. In other words, without that language, you can't think those thoughts.
Wow, interesting.
And those thoughts are sprung from the earth and the habitat rather than from the illusion of what economics weaves.
Well, thank you so much, Jack Loeffler, for joining us. And how can people reach you if they want to find out more about you, read some of your books?
Well, I don't have a website. I'm just
call the station.
A lot of my radio series have been broadcast over KSFR, by the way, and I think I even gave Mary Lynn a thumb drive with 72 radio programs on it.
Wow.
But at any rate, those programs go all the way back into the 1980s, and they almost all focus on these same issues.
Yeah.
But I really think that what we have to really hearken back to is our indigenous mindset. I mean, each of us is indigenous to this planet. We are biologically evolved over billions of years in this planet, and we have to bear that in mind and heart. I'm getting boring even to myself, but I mean, it's the same problem no matter how you look at it. But the idea is to really go in there with full tilt imagination and do your best.
And unfortunately, we need to take a break right now, but we'll be right back after these short messages. You're listening to Dialogue, and I'm your host, MK. We're speaking with Jack Loeffler today, and we're going to go into more detail of in terms of what we talked about in our first half hour. So let's talk a bit about this notion of being single-minded in our focus over profit and how we begin to change that and where that was born and how we move out of that.
Well, it's going to be a tough call because we're now many generations into something that actually kind of occurred. Well, it occurred a long time ago when the haves started to come along, thousands of years ago, and the have-nots became the people who actually had to they were the folks who had to provide for the haves. And that's still going on right now. And but it really got kicked off big time with the Industrial Revolution of, say, 200-300 years ago. And I wish I could play you what I got my buddy Ed Abbey to talk about with regard to this. But that was the beginning of it, in a way. But one of the things that has really come along is the United States of America became economically particularly vigorous during the 1920s, and all of a sudden we were having to look at things. People were just, the banks were taking over, and there's a word that is escaping my frontal lobes right this minute, but at any rate, we were really looking at monopolies. That was the word. And so there were laws put in place to try to quell the monopolies. But at the same time, in 1929, which is now about 89 years ago, last month, there was the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash of magnitude, which resulted in the Great Depression. And the Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1942. We entered Second World War in 1941. I was born in 1936, and that was right smack in the heart of it. Bad year. Economics was taking a huge nosedive. I had talked to my old friend Stuart Udall, who had been a kid in St. John's, Arizona, throughout the Great Depression, and he pointed out that the people who lived in rural areas fared far better than the people who lived in urban areas by virtue of knowing how to live off the land. And which the village of St. John's, Arizona, shared with the Indian villages of the Pueblos and the isolated communities of the Navajos and the Apaches throughout that region. When his grandfather settled that place, Geronimo had yet to be captured.
Wow.
Actually, Geronimo was captured only 50 years before I was born. That begins to put things in some sort of an historic perspective.
Right, it does. When you begin to look at history through lifetimes of even relatives and the rights they had or who they might have known, that's when you realize just how short history actually is.
Oh, it sure is.
Right? I mean, and also how nothing really changes and how long it takes to make change. And, I want to go also back to this grassroots notion you were talking about going back to learning from the indigenous cultures and why New Mexico has a particular advantage in a sense in that way, in that we have so many American Indian folks within our own communities. How can we best utilize this community for our own growth or acknowledge them, or how important is that relationship?
Well, to me, it's vitally important. There's so many different things I could talk about right now. In 1964, I lived in a hogan, an old fork-stick hogan at Navajo Mountain for several months. And I got to know Navajo people, none of whom spoke English, except one 12-year-old boy. But friendships occurred there that I really treasure to this day. And I first snapped to the fact that to a huge amount, culture is shaped by the habitat that sprouts it, so to speak. And Navajos became culturally conscious here in the Southwest as the people they are today. Nobody knows exactly when they started migrating into the area, the Athabascans that include the Apaches and the Navajos. But ostensibly they came later than the ancestral Puebloans, who are known to have been here for at least 12,000 years, many years longer. Since that time, this is 54 years ago, I've spent much of my life spending time with indigenous peoples throughout the American West and Mexico. And I've said this before, but I've never met a traditional indigenous person who did not regard the landscape as sacred.
Yeah, and you also talk about the notion of everything being sacred, treating everything in our world as sacred. Everything.
Yes. As Ed Abbey pointed out, either everything is divine or nothing is. Ed actually talked about one of the great mistakes Western culture has done, and this may offend people, but I totally concur, is that when we took the gods out of nature and created a transcendental God far and out of space, we blew it. Yeah. Because that's when we achieved a real contempt for nature. And that's a big thought. Now, I had another friend. He was one of my history mentors, a man named Alvin Josephi. When I met him back in the 60s, he was still alive, but he was also the editor-in-chief at American Heritage Books and Magazine. And in his lifetime, Alvin wrote 17 books about Native Americans. It was actually formally adopted into the Nez Perce culture as an honorary Nez Perce Indian up in Idaho and Washington. But the upshot is, one time when I was interviewing Alvin for a radio series I was producing, Southwest Sound Collage was the name of that series, Alvin said, it's not a question of whether Indians will vanish. They won't. But it's a question of whether Indianness will vanish. Mm. And by that he was referring to that intuition of the sacred nature of homeland and habitat. Mm-hmm. And so he was seeing the race between really trying to invigorate that on a much broader basis than just indigenous cultures like we have in abundance here in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. But he was also witnessing, as have I, how so many of those cultures, at least parts of those cultures, been subsumed by economics as we see them.
Yeah, infiltrated, as it were.
Yes. And as an example of that, traditional Hopi Indians back in 1970 asked me to start the Black Mesa Defense Fund, a mesa that was sacred to Hopis and Navajos, traditionals, was about to be strip mined in order to provide coal for a coal-fired power plant up by Lake Powell in order to provide energy for the Central Arizona Project, to pump water out of the Colorado River into the central valleys of Arizona, ostensibly for agriculture. Mm. But the water was so expensive by the time it got there that it was too expensive for agriculture, and subsequently, as my late friend Stuart Udall pointed out, caused the metastasis of both Phoenix and Tucson, which is quite a thought. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, many Indian peoples, I was working with a lot of traditional Indian peoples who really didn't want that mine to happen. Well, it has happened now since then. We were not able to stop the Central Arizona Project. But the upshot is that in the generations, 2.5 generations, since we founded the Black Mesa Defense Fund, a lot of the sons and daughters of the people who were asking me to try to help them stop this are now trying to buy the coal mine in order to make money from the mining of coal themselves. And so there is a tragedy. That's a major tragedy of the subsuming of an indigenous perspective that is vital for our collective survival. Yeah.
As a translator, because you've known so much and done so much work with the indigenous peoples, and you talked earlier about the notion that language, even their language, doesn't quite translate into English. There are things, and I know I speak Spanish also, and there are things you say in a language that you just can't quite say the same way in another language. And if you could try to translate what some of those values are, or maybe favorite words you have that translate that mindset, what would those be? I'm just curious.
Well, in Spanish.
Or from the indigenous culture and their languages, was there any particular, if you could sum it up, like in Spanish, I can give you an example. In Spanish, they say se roto, like it broke itself. Well, that means that there's no one ever really that is responsible for having broken it. But in some ways, you could say, well, there's no sense of guilt, or not the same kind of thing that maybe American culture might have. And you can also say that it's sort of this acceptance that things happen. And so in that mindset, that Latin mindset, there's more acceptance for things going wrong. And kind of, so are there examples of that you can think of in indigenous cultures? I'm just curious.
Well, there are examples of perspective. I mean, I don't know. I've never learned an indigenous language. I'm only Pidgin Spanish.
Yeah.
But I wanted to mention one word in Spanish.
Yeah.
My buddy Enrique La Madrid. Do you know Enrique, perchance?
I don't, but the name is very familiar.
He's recently retired as the chair of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at UNM, and he and I have collaborated on books and a bunch of stuff and Run Wild Rivers. But he introduced me to the term Cadencia, which comes from the verb querer. And what it means, the word in Cadencia itself does not have an English language equivalent.
Right.
But basically it means the place that you feel most comfortable in habitat-wise on the planet. I first ran across the word in one of the Hemingway novels where the bull in the bull ring had sought its cadencia because it knew it was going to die there. Well, two terrific Hispano scholars, including Enrique and then also Esteban Arellano, who lived in Emburo, died 4 years ago, Halloween, but one of the great thinkers in my lifetime at any rate. But they both talked about cadencia and how it's where a culture is so affiliated with the homeland. And to me, Hispano culture is indigenous. I mean, boy, 20 generations makes a culture indigenous.
Yeah.
You know.
Right.
And in light of the fact that, like, say, 20,000 years ago, humans weren't here at all.
Right.
Probably. You know, the new world as we think of it, North American and South American continents, evolved incredible life forms that didn't have human input. And that blows my mind. I mean, what we've done to these two continents is amazing. But the upshot is that, and this is one of the things, I have another good friend, Esteban Doral Galvez. I don't know if you know him, but he's a really brilliant man. I just had lunch with him 2 days ago, but the upshot is that he pointed out in his doctoral dissertation that there's not a single Hispano that doesn't have some Native American blood. In other words, that's the great mestizaje from which the term mestizo comes. And so those cultural, it's not just bloodlines, it's cultural perspectives had to come into some sort of a mixture. And to me, Hispano culture is absolutely amazing. I've just am working on a project right now on the history of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which is an amazing history. And I've interviewed people up all the way down to Mexico City, all the way up to here, talking about what that road really meant. Well, what it meant to Native Americans who were here was far different than what it meant to, say, Oñate when he was bringing up the colonists. But to the people who were here, their gods were still in nature with the Kachina dances and whatever, the Yebiches with the Navajo. The gods, the local deities, were here in their lives, and they communicated with them as in their ceremonials and in their dances and in their hearts and in their minds and in their songs. To me, music is a huge mnemonic device for adhering culture to homeland, to habitat. I mean, I've spent a lot of time recording, say, Hispano folk music. I've recorded somewhere close to 4,000 Hispano folk songs at this point. And I have recorded many corridos, which contain much of the history of Hispano-ness here in both New Mexico. Claes Geiberschram, in his book, noted that you could trace the entire history of the Mexican Revolution in the corridos, the narratives, the narrative ballads. Now, those songs in the equivalents in Indian cultures do the same thing. They celebrate the divinity that appears everywhere within the context of nature. In other words, they celebrate the flow of nature. They're much more here and now minded than past and present minded in my experience. I don't like to try to speak for them, but I do know that Rena, I mean, wow, what a thinker. She was incredible. Did you ever have a chance?
I know of Rena Swenson. I never met her, unfortunately. No, I did not.
Wow.
But,
her mind was
kind of like who doesn't know?
Yeah,
Rena
she's
Swenson.
amazing. Well, to me, talking to Rena was like pouring spring water over your frontal lobes. It was just really great. I've known 5 generations of that family. And what a family. It's the most talented family I've ever seen anywhere. But the upshot is that she conveyed to me as best she could in English, because I don't speak Tewa, the Puebloan Indian perspective, the sense of everything is interconnected. Life is interconnected. Rocks are interconnected with life. To those folks, rocks are still alive. The water's alive. It's all alive. And it all maintains a collective level of cognition. And that cognition is based on balance within itself. In other words, they celebrate wholeheartedly the flow of nature.
Yeah.
And one of the things I try to bring out now, so much of human legislation, especially here and elsewhere, I'm sure, human legislation, especially here, violates the laws of nature. And I hearken back to Henry David Thoreau. When human law violates natural law, it's time for big-time conscientious. You break the law to celebrate the right law. Civil disobedience is a huge factor there. And I celebrate civil disobedience. I believe that it can be done positively with a positive perspective. But I really think that what we have to really hearken back to is our indigenous mindset. I mean, each of us is indigenous to this planet. We are biologically evolved over billions of years in this planet, and we have to bear that in mind and heart. And one of the things that I've learned so much from my Native American friends and many of my Hispano friends is that intuition is absolutely a huge factor. We in Western culture have spent so much time reductionist thinking. Now, reductionist thinking works in a scientific mode when you're trying to break things down. But unless you see the bigger picture, it's not very useful.
Right.
It can be useful when it's applied properly, but it has to be seen within its own context, which is the bigger sphere of reference. A long time ago, I had a vision, pull all the nails out of my frame of reference, and try to engross myself in a sphere of reference in order to be able to reside in my lifetime at the heart of seeing things in relationship to each other. Thus, I dropped out of college at the end of my sophomore year. I felt that this is not the way I want to learn.
Wow.
I don't want my mind shaped this way. I want to shape my own mind or let it be shaped by the flow of nature. And to me, my great education has come from talking to people whose minds, for whom I have enormous respect, regardless of culture.
We need a Jack Loeffler University.
Ah.
Can you start one, please?
I don't believe in institutions.
Because, that's the other thing is so many people go to school and then they think they know everything or they're an expert in. It's because they have a few, letters after their name. And it's like, wait, you've got this degree and you missed the whole point. How did that happen and how does that happen? And, of course, it's to some degree the industrialization again or consumerism and the powers that be infiltrating even our academic institutions. But people often don't make that correlation or don't see that those two go hand in hand.
They do go hand in. My friend Ed Abbey, in his last published article, as far as I know, but he said you take any person walking down the street, and that person has more wit and wisdom than any institution. And I really believe that because you're concretizing perspective.
Right.
And it's that
That's a good way to put it. That's exactly.
And to me, we've got to take the rebar out and let it get bigger.
Right.
And we can't do that with intellect alone. And we are equipped basically with intuition. But through our intellectual approach to so much, we've culturally and even individually allowed that ability to be intuitive to atrophy. And this is a grave mistake. So I think that this is one of the things, like taking a morning walk and greeting the fellow creatures, be they trees or birds or foxes or coyotes or whatever, and recognizing that here is a fellow cognizant being, regardless of animal, vegetable, or other, and really coming to terms with the fact that we, as conscious human beings, have all of this equipment to understand the flow of nature and to participate in accord with those rules rather than the ridiculous rules that we've made up for ourselves within that context. In other words, I think of it as skinny dipping in the flow of nature, and it feels right to me. I've been doing it forever. And it's so right on. I mean, when nature is your friend, rather than something over which you try to acquire mastery, you begin to see a different way of looking at things. And so with regard to how do we comport ourselves, well, first of all, here in the Rio Grande Valley or throughout New Mexico, we have so many different cultural perspectives. Rather than trying to find places of disagreement, find places of agreement. I have an acquaintance down in the boot heel of New Mexico, a man named Bill McDonald, a rancher, who came up with a brilliant notion one day: look for the radical center, which is where ranchers, environmentalists, and bureaucrats all come together and seek something that's going to be conciliatory and work in a good way. I've met many ranchers now that way. Sid Goodlow, great friend down near Carrizozo, fantastic rancher, does a beautiful job, actually is helping the land restore rather than be taken out by the ranchers.
And something that dawns on me as I'm listening to you speak, that cooperation is also more intuitive. I mean, we are naturally drawn to want to get along. We don't want to divide. We don't want to not like each other. We want to get along.
We do. I mean,
we really do. It's
and
just
that's
our nature.
the first thing. I mean, that's the first. Gee whiz! I mean,
we actually go through a lot to avoid conflict. We put ourselves through a lot just to avoid conflict.
Absolutely.
And because we want to get along so badly.
Well, one of the things that strikes me just as you're saying that, I mean, like walking down, say, Fifth Avenue and Broadway, nobody looks you in the eye. But out in rural countryside, everybody looks in the eye.
Yeah.
And one of the greatest experiences I ever had, sitting in my studio with a western window, was one day I looked out, and there, 4 feet away on the other side of the window, was a bobcat. And we looked each other in the eye. And that was a doorway to some level of perception that, wow, that was one of the better experiences in this lifetime.
Right.
It lasted a long time, long enough that I was almost hypnotized by this incredible presence.
Yeah.
And there was a level of mutual cooperation there. I had another experience way back when.
I felt that way when I went scuba diving and I saw the fish.
Yes.
Underneath the bottom of the ocean. I thought, wow, there is an entire universe here that I know nothing of. And all I could do is respect it. And it exists without my intervention.
Beautiful.
They're fine without me. But there was such a level of respect. It becomes an experience, a body cellular experience when you have that kind of contact.
Yeah, that's great that you do that. I've never scuba dived.
But I think it's something like the bobcat.
Yeah, it is. Well,
it's
another
that
time I
interaction
was
with nature.
Camped in a cave over in northern Nevada up in the desert, and a bobcat cub climbed up on my chest that had been abandoned by its mom, opened its mouth over my throat and started to purr.
Oh, wow.
And that was beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Wow.
And I finally, and a friend of mine and I lived with that cub for a while, but then we knew that it needed to be feral to survive in beauty. Yeah. And so we took it to the Fish and Wildlife and they put it where it should be. But looking at other species and recognizing that they're our cousins, they really are.
And we are each other's cousins as human beings, instead of this right and left and Democrat and Republican and, we or race, black and white,
Yeah. Oh, no, I know that so well. I mean, our species achieved true specieshood. This is a thought I think about all the time. We really made it by about 50,000 years ago. I mean, our hominids ancestors were pretty close to being human, starting about 200,000 years ago. But since we have achieved true specieshood, Homo sapiens, there have been about 106 billion of us live on the planet, 6% of whom are still here.
Wow.
And that's kind of a weird thought. And the truth is we have overpopulated. We can consciously reduce our numbers. I would start with population. And I would also include, in a perfect world, everybody having the opportunity to be outside as much as possible, because we need that outsidedness, that outdoorsness, in order to open our hearts and minds. I mean, wow, when you look at the night sky over New Mexico, you're seeing something that is a rare sight anymore in the United States. It's just an incredible thing.
And unfortunately, on that note, we are out of time.
I'm so sorry, MK, because I'm having more fun.
We could keep going all day and night. I love leaving on that note. Let's hope we can all have more of those one-on-one connections with nature and with each other, right?
Absolutely, MK, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you. It's been a real honor to have you on this show.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for joining us. We will see you next week right here on Dialogue 101.1 FM.
Talk to me. Talk to me.